Hello, Sema, our spiritual ethical community. This is our academic, business, and industrial intersections of scripture and how it can help us make for more um, planet, people, prioritizing businesses, and preserving profits. Now, that being said, we are in chapter 4 of the season, Oats and Toast. That's season 6. We're in the last leg. Today's lesson is titled The Spiritual Sensitivity and Savvy to Protect Our Bread. The scripture texts are coming from the books of Job, chapter 28, verse 5 through 6, 20 and 22 and 28. Then the book of Psalm, chapter 9, verse 18 through 19, and Psalm chapter 105, verse 15 through 17 and 22. So again, how spiritual sensitivity and savvy can help to protect our bread. So we'll let the scripture speak for themselves because the scripture is a vibrant and dynamic force by its own nature, and then we are going to apply that to our business, academic, and industrial endeavors. So starting off with Job chapter 28, verse 5 through 6, and then verse 20, 22, and 28. It reads, "As for the earth, from it comes bread, but underneath it is turned up as by fire. Its stones are a source of sapphires, and it contains gold dust." From where does wisdom come, and where is the place of understanding? Destruction and death say, "We have heard a report about it in our ears." And to man, God said, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." Psalm chapter 9. 18 through 19. "For the needy shall not always be forgotten, the expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged in your sight. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. Selah. And lastly, Psalm 105. Psalm 105, verse 15, saying, "Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm." Moreover, he called for a famine in the land. He destroyed all the provision of bread. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. Verse 22. To bind his princes at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. So thank you, Sema Ethical Energy Community, for hearing these scriptures. Please feel free to review them in your free time or in addition to looking them over here. So we're going to go into the background. Bread is a staple crop. It represents provision, it represents stability, and obviously it represents a nutrient source. To have absence of bread indicates a bad omen. And bread also indicates whether somebody's a breadwinner, whether they have income. So acquiring bread is not only by being a farmer, it's also by work, vocation, business, commerce. So the 3 points of this lesson: spiritual sensitivity and having savvy to protect our bread. Number 1, wisdom is not automatic. It's not automatic. In addition, even though it's not easily acquired, it's famous once it is applied to a situation where there was a need. Wisdom becomes famous once it is applied to a situation where it answered a need. So that's number one. Number two, there usually involves helpers. In order to apply wisdom, especially in times of crisis, we need helpers. And that savvy and sensitivity also means to decipher who are the correct helpers, who are the proper helpers. Lastly, and the final point is that if there is a physical bread supply problem, there is a spiritual solution. There is a spiritual solution. So those are our 3 points. Number one is that wisdom is hard to come by. However, once it is applied to a situation where it was needed, it becomes way world famous, very famous. Number two, helpers. There are helpers required, typically spiritual, celestial helpers to find and apply wisdom. And number three, if there is a physical bread problem, there is a spiritual solution. So, world famous. In Job chapter 28 and 20, we see a whole host of different entities making comments about where's wisdom, where can we find wisdom, and how can we apply them. One thing is common in verse 5, from the earth comes bread. However, where does wisdom come from? Where does wisdom come from? Because the earth could be producing bread, it could be producing stable crops like grains, and other reliable food. However, that doesn't mean the population is fed. It takes wisdom and discipline to keep the supply chain going and keep the population fed. And so we even get to this very precarious and a very striking verse in Job chapter 28, where destruction and death are making a comment. Destruction and death, frequently, one of their very common tools is starvation, is food insecurity. So destruction and death say, we have heard a report about wisdom in our ears, but we don't know where it comes from. However, even destruction and death know that wisdom is very powerful, and it can actually help people to escape or defeat destruction and death. And one of the main ways, keeping the bread supply, the food chain, the provision going. Number two, what do our helpers look like? In Psalm chapter 105, verse 16 and verse 17, a famine struck the land. And then they sent Joseph. So there was a physical problem because the famine had hit. Joseph was already a prophetic interpreter, and he read and interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh and interpreted that there was going to be a famine in advance prior to it arriving. Once it arrived, however, the real power of Joseph's wisdom really manifested in the fact that he held the bread rod to keep the supply of bread going when the earth said, we are not giving you any more bread. So all the bumper crops that Joseph had stockpiled became the provision of bread. And that is an example of a physical problem being answered by a spiritual solution, because it wasn't plant more wheat. It wasn't get more water. That was not the solution. The solution to the famine was spiritual insight or studiousness or scholarship, and that meant applying it in a fair, judicious fashion so that the ancient world did not starve. So now that we've looked at those examples, scholars, activists, and savvy consumers, what are some ways that we can apply our common experience or our personal experience, our education or our real world field work to supply bread and keep the supply chain going. As these examples have shown, bread supplies is not intuitive, it's not automatic, it's not a given. It's not something that we can necessarily obviously calculate. We cannot calculate the weather. It was not on every meteorologist's forecast. Oh, in X and Y Z years, there's going to be this famine. At least not in the days of Joseph. And so, since so many things can prove daunting to discern and react to, and especially to be proactive with, which is what we want, we need to have prayerful lives. We need to pray over our food supply. We need to pray over and assist and proactively stop the onslaught and the onset of hunger. And unfortunately, hunger is still very much in even very wealthy societies, but that doesn't mean it has to stay. So, like Joseph, we can have a tight relationship with God. We can have a strong spiritual sensitivity. We can be practicing different forms of honorable and ethical spiritual practices to get ahead of the eight ball. Where is hunger coming from? What mechanisms is the current hunger utilizing to present and manifest? And so, by being proactive and being present in our communities and saying hunger does not belong here, we can really combine our minds and our energies for that positive outcome. So, for example, fighting hunger, first prayer. We don't want to just assume we know the answer. It's not just, oh, more land, more irrigation. What is actually driving the cost of food up? What is actually making food reach bottlenecks to where it doesn't disperse as well? Why are there food deserts in certain parts of the country? In addition, there are many ancient and tried and tested farming and irrigation practices that work passively, but we are not implementing at an industrial scale or even as a backup when industrial scales fail. How about we have those backups in place? Additionally, starting or resuming the practice of home gardens. Obviously, not everybody has a green thumb, but there are aquaponics, automatic timer, and water recycling gardens where you can put your seedlings and watch them grow, and you preserve water because it's not watering from the hose with a fresh amount of water. It's water that was already in the chamber, and then it recycles and keeps watering until it gets lower. Saving a portion of our extra groceries or canned food, non-perishable foods for pantries in addition to our own homes. That is a major assistance. And in general, cutting down on food waste. Think about other less popular but very effective solutions like pick your produce yourself operations. Now, in some cases, you will have to teach the public how to properly harvest the food without damaging the stem or the plant, but that is a very effective way of cutting down on labor. In addition, more ergonomic and safe conditions for farming. A lot of people consider farming to be a last ditch resort and not even a favorable form of employment. The extreme temperatures, the exposure to the elements, and obviously the very heavy grueling work drives a lot of people away. But let's be assured that the same system of assembly lines and implementing ergonomic work conditions and having some form of shade and temperature control could bring a lot more people into farming or food production who simply could not otherwise because it's too tedious, it is too dangerous with the extreme temperature swings and exposure to pesticides. So if we had work conditions that were safe, that were more ergonomic, and where the heavy lifting was done either by some simple apparatus, simple pulley systems, or different mechanisms, we could actually increase the workforce the way that the assembly line both increased employment and the amount of product that would leave the factory, being the automobile. And so, really, consumers and policymakers and just general public, we all can put our heads together to end hunger. And we will be far, far better off when we do. Well, I hope that this was helpful. If you did find it insightful, please remember to like, share, subscribe, hit notifications, and we will see you in the next SEMA episode.